this was a great set of talks. Exclude mine from that statement. Other than that, it was a great set of talks on a variety of topics. Some of them, of course, had more algorithmic set of aspects to them, and some of them had the more sort of applied set of aspects to them. And I get reminded of that slide, that had 3 tiers and says, okay, here's the basic stuff that we need to know, and then here are the barriers that we're facing and the kinds of requirements that are at the top level. So what I was hoping to do in the panel is to try to integrate that. So it's kind of the key theme here is kind of integration. And I'd like to do it in 2 axes, if we can. One is research to application, and the other one is across the various domains that we have for the societal infrastructure. So we heard about electric vehicles, we heard about buildings, the grid. There is a variety of themes. The first question I'd like to pose to the panelists is what is your view on the integration? Now, let me just say, I feel we are somehow on the ground floor of the integration. As I said earlier, we're developing a bunch of algorithms, and then so I'd like to ask you collectively, what are the requirements so that we can kind of have a collective energy brain at one point, automate or artificial energy brain at some point in the future. So I hope that's exciting enough to kick it off. Who'd like to start? I'll call on David, because he's the first on the right to my screen.
Sure, no problem. So I think there's 2 aspects that we need to be thinking about. There's a lot of conversations, a lot of great ideas on algorithms for the integration and tools for the integration. I think one of our challenges right now is what are the financial incentives that can be generated and the markets that can be generated to take advantage of that integration. And that's really, I think, critical for us to figure out because at the end of the day, we've got to have a way for people to be able to implement these and either get payback or get paid in some way or save money by that integration. Some of that is in the early phases of being evaluated by the PUC as part of their current microgrid proceeding, where they're looking at tariffs for microgrid control and microgrid involvement. And that's currently really focused on I would say mostly on individual buildings, microgrids for individual buildings. We have other regulatory barriers for the broader contingent of that. But I think we're gonna have to look at other strategies for what are the market opportunities and creating a market incentive for this integration more broadly.
Thank you. Let's see, Sila, would you like to?
Sure. So when I think about integration, I think about all of these industries that I worked in, right? Buildings, very fragmented industry where there are key companies that are trying to protect their domain. Transportation, extremely fragmented, especially when you go into electrification. Again, a lot of industries trying to protect their domain. This kind of fragmented industry, the nature of the industry, the fragmentation, and the companies that are trying to protect their domain makes it almost impossible to standardize things across the industries. And so without the standardization, I think there's a lot of wasted resources and one-off deployments, which really does not lend themselves to a really nice, integrated framework. And looking at these things holistically, right? I think the other piece is that, as David said, there has to be some value in the marketplace for this integration. Integration is extremely fun problem for academics to solve, and I really enjoy, tackling integration issues with different algorithms, different approaches, different sort of objective functions, even, right? But in the marketplace or in the deployments, there has to be some sort of a value, whether it's the lowering of the cost or ease of use or something. And a lot of us tend to sort of do it without really understanding where the value is going to come from. And if there are no markets that can put a value on these efforts, then we should really either think about creating these markets first, or doing it together, not just focus on the technology, but also the markets. And then the other piece for me that's really important is the policy side. We need policies that understand the technologies, support the development of these markets, and so that technology developers can continue to find value in the market and continue to develop their products.
That's a great set of comments. I pointed out this tragedy of the commons in the in the residential buildings area, where monthly you get $15 back if you save any energy, right? And for all of us, that's one cup of cappuccino. Just kidding, it's not there yet, but it will be soon. For most of us, $15, right? If we work just a little bit longer, we can make that. And so there is no incentive, and yet at the national level, state level, national level, that actually provides a lot of money. $15 billion is not a small amount of money collectively. Do you have any sort of specific ideas, or anybody else actually on the panel, any specific ideas in this direction, or is this something that is really hard to crack?
Igor, this is Gary from SE. I would agree. That's a challenge we see with some of our programs and our customers. We saw that, to a certain extent in the solar industry, where you had solar thermal was a great solution, but for hot water, but the savings were so small that it just didn't excite people. Going forward in the utility side, sometimes we are trying to bundle offerings just for that reason. It's more interesting to somebody if you can create a bigger value proposition. $10 a month is not that exciting to move somebody to action, right? Or $15 a month. So plus everybody has their own world they're living in. We live in the world of energy or technology, but most people don't, and they have their day-to-day they're worried about. So to catch their attention on something, it has to be meaningful. And so sometimes bundled offerings, both in the private sector work and in the utility side. And in the utilities, we don't do research ourselves, so we're integrated in terms of our partnerships. We partner with David and the CEC, as he said, on a lot of projects, and we partner with the private sector on a lot of our emerging tech type reviews and demonstrate it. But even when we've demonstrated the technology, the performance, then you still have that other hurdle to get over, and that adoption hurdle oftentimes is, you got to find a way to very specifically target it. Sila mentioned, you have these fragmented markets, right? We're talking about building electrification, and you have building owners, you have landlords, and you have tenants. Okay, well, who's your, most likely target there, and how are you going to convince them? And it may be that you need to do it as part of something larger. People also criticize these state programs and the programs that we roll out because of the scale of them and the cost of them. And, there's a reason for that. To achieve these big numbers, they have to be high volume. They have to be scalable. Changing one or two, electrifying one or two water heaters or plugging in one or two EVs isn't going to cut it. And so it is large scale. And part of the trick is to find what combination of policy, incentives, and other outreach. Frankly, that's really important. The successful programs in the past have tried to balance that. What kind of financial incentives can you add, whether it's federal or state or local? What kind of education and outreach can you do? And then it's not just about the technology, it's not just about the performance.
Thanks.
I would like to chime in. Yeah, I think I think the idea that we can keep electricity so cheap, even if we go to 50% renewables without changing, the state of things, is also a little bit problematic. Like, electricity cannot possibly stay reliable and cheap if we go to 50% renewables and don't change anything. And I think, I saw a lot of people, not really believe the value of the type of things we do until they started seeing blackouts, this past few years. And then people were like suddenly investing in solar panels and storage systems and things like that, because I don't think it's so much necessarily just the cost of electricity, but the reliability of service that drives people towards adopting perhaps new technologies that make sure that they're receiving reliable service, perhaps. And I think we have some also questions from the audience. I don't know how you guys want to handle that. There's some comments. I think all of you can see them. So perhaps you can decide how.
Igor, I want to make one other comment to follow on to Mahnoosh and Gary, which is the education and outreach, but also understanding the full value. So $15 a month may not mean much to some people in California. For others, $15 a month may mean a lot when they're living paycheck to paycheck. But when that's combined with maybe reduced impacts of asthma or reliability, resilience, that may not have a monetary value, but is something that is near and dear to their heart or their children's health and happiness, it can start making a difference. And so the education of the multiple benefits of improvements, I think, has to be shared.
Yeah, and to David's comment, a classic example of that is when we're talking to people now about, kind of a emerging area of induction cooking, right? The savings from switching from a gas cooking to electric induction cooking are not significant, but there's some performance and energy efficiency benefits, some small savings, but there's also, to David's comment, there's significant health differences. And so those are part of the kind of the bundled value proposition that I think people need to know about too. Or to Manoosh's point, things like reliability, depending on the kind of topic we're covering as well.
Thanks. I do have several Q&A items. There was one question that says, didn't Enron try something like this in 2000? I don't quite know what something like this actually refers to. So if Glenn could specify that. That was referencing a particular comment by one of us, but I'm not sure exactly what. So another question from Scott is, assuming standardization and repeatability improve quality control in buildings, what are ways to move in this direction so that buildings are more one source manufacturing like cars and computers? I think this question goes in the direction of, okay, Tesla can produce an efficient car because they own the product. And I think Sila pointed this out, that there is such a fragmentation between building operators, owners, and managers, and then who really talks to utilities and who does. Everything is kind of a fraction. Does anybody have a thought on this? I think it's quite an interesting question. It's been a standing question since I started thinking about this area, and it doesn't seem to go away. So fragmentation in buildings, maybe Sila?
Yeah, I mean, the buildings industry tried to go towards standards like BACnet and lawn works and things like early in the 90s. These are older standards. And what surprises me constantly is that we're going back to some really primitive standards that work as opposed to standards that have bells and whistles, like Modbus. Modbus is completely used in a lot of the projects today, but it's really an old technology that has a lot of problems in terms of security and things like that. So anyway, my point is that standards don't evolve as fast as technologies evolve. And some of the standards that are out there are actually sort of preventing from new technologies to get into these spaces. And some big companies are just avoiding all of those standards anyway and having their own proprietary technologies, just like, it's very difficult to sell to Tesla as a technology provider because they build everything themselves and they have their proprietary integration within their systems. That's the same thing that a lot of the companies have been trying to move. But again, I don't have a really good answer for this. I think we've tried standards. We just need standards that move as fast as technologies can, or that are responsive to some of these technologies as they develop.
And you just mentioned another important piece, which is the security issue, because we're getting, this Internet of Things universe. Despite the negative tone of this particular discussion. Actually, the Internet of Things universe is becoming more interconnected and more integrated. And that brings with itself some dangers. I mean, you mentioned BACnet, and a lot of commercial buildings are on BACnet, right? And it is not entirely clear that the standards for security in that context are actually the same as standards for security that we have on the computers that are currently in operation for all of us. And even, Zoom had some issues at the beginning, but it seems like they fixed them. You might remember the Target breach some 5 or 6 years ago, right? That was now where hackers went through a vendor's access to the BACnet system and then actually hacked into the target customer base. Not to mention issues like somebody can actually hack into your building and spin up the compressor. That is not a fun thought, right? Any thoughts there? Anybody?
I think it's really important that we actually fundamentally design the algorithms we use so that they are resilient against, such adversarial influences. And I think, like, if you look at the type of control algorithms we deploy in buildings or for grid operation in general, they operate under the assumption that every information we receive is accurate. In terms of, state estimation and things like this in grid operation, there has been recent work on making sure that, corrupted states are essentially recognized in operation. But in terms of demand response and things like that, there's very little work that looks at this. And these are things that can directly control people's homes and, lives and things like that. And so it's really important that we design resilient algorithms. And this sort of also highlights the fact that, Internet of Things is not just about energy, it's actually coupling multiple infrastructures together. And so when we want to integrate things, we really need to keep that in mind as well.
Those are some great comments. Let me point out, I'm going to reflect on an issue that I think about a lot, and there is this gap between the academic walls and the real world. And I think a number of you pointed this out, because Mahnoosh, you're arguing, security by design.
Not just security by design, but also security by design.
Okay, also security by design. The point
because things are out there, so we can't clearly do just security by design, right? We need to work with what's already out there, right? Correct.
The point I want to make is we know there are a lot of solutions in the academic world for this kind of a thing. Most of them are untested in the real world because there is a gap between the kind of research public and the private. There's this gap, and I think this is a great segue for me into the second question that I had on my list. But in the meantime, Glenn said, fundamental problem with negative energy equals...
Glenn is right here, Igor. Glenn is... Maybe he can ask you.
Oh yeah, can you say this? Because it actually segues nicely into what I wanted to ask next.
Well, I just think that it's difficult to consolidate all the energy savings when you have small incremental gains at the consumer point of contact. And like we supply power supplies to the cable television industry, for example, and trying to improve the energy efficiency of the power supply, all the cost falls on Comcast or Cox or whomever. So they may have to pay 20% more for a power supply to yield like 10 cents a month savings to the consumer. So we tried to work a deal with the PUC where, hey, if we could get accelerated use of deployment of these better technologies, could we get the rebates go back directly to someone like Comcast or Cox? And it became just a regulatory nightmare. I worked with the guys over at Brandon to see if we could figure out a way to do it, but it's just a bureaucracy. So then you talk to NOAA, who is also trying to work with the cable operators and do a voluntary process to increase the energy efficiency of all these components. And they don't want to spend more capital so that their customer can save money. It's just not the incentive is inverted in a funny way. So I don't know how you do it. That was my input. That's a real world situation that we've been fighting for years now. because it's just like we sell literally millions of power supplies, and a 3% increase times a million, it actually turns into a lot.
So that's where it's useful if there's standards, right? And I think California has led in terms of standards for energy efficiency. And I mean, the need for that is really clear given how much the federal government has pulled back, right? So fortunately, California has its standards for automobiles or for energy efficiency of appliances or for LEDs. So actually, I do have a question for David along that line, which is, I presume you can still impose all of your own standards, right? I know you have a standard on prohibiting selling incandescent light bulbs, though it seems like I still see them in the store. So I'm just curious if the fact that the federal government has pulled back has negatively impacted what you can do in California, or do you take precedent?
Yeah, it's not my particular area of expertise, but my understanding is that hasn't affected our ability to set our own standards. And so the state's continuing to look at new ways to ratchet down on energy use so that we can continue to improve appliances and improve the efficiency of buildings.
So to Glenn's comment, then, we really should just get more. There should be standards for cable-top boxes, right, Glenn? I mean,
yeah, and it's yes, they're agreed. They worked within, Noah's and his group worked with industry to get what was reasonable in a cost-effective time frame. And so what you're trying to do is bank the forward progress and and retire the older stuff. But there's no cost incentive from the operator side to retire old cars or old light bulbs or old power supplies. And that's the thing that you try to figure out how to do to get there quicker. But light bulbs die, power supplies fail, cars die. Over time you get there, but it just takes a little bit longer than it may. The technology is moving forward. It's good. You don't go backwards. I mean, with the exception of the Trump thing with the funny incandescent bulbs, you don't really go backwards on energy efficiency normally, because over time as you ramp and as you scale production of power supplies, the cost tends to be where it used to be anyway, and you get that efficiency over time, and then you just bank it, kind of like low flush water toilets. Same thing. You don't ever go back to higher volume toilets.
Yeah, and to Glenn's comment, there's, we raise our standards too. So for example, in the state on our energy efficiency programs, we're offering incentives, but we do raise the baseline on things. So we're saying we're going to give you an incentive to do X, but those incentives can vary depending on, obviously, on the technology, but also from where you're starting. And the point is, we're trying to encourage people to bring things up to date. So you're going to get a better incentive if there's a greater differential there. And so over time, the market does respond to that as well. The market they know what the baseline considerations are. So when a private, and I'm talking energy efficiency here, not necessarily hardware, it can be hardware or it could be systems design or something, but when people are specifying a starting point, they're gonna get pulled up by these efficiency gains over time. And it's hard to do. Some products or some devices have longer life cycles, as Glenn just mentioned. You can have a 30 or 40-year-old device, and it maybe has a 30-year life. You don't get very many opportunities to replace it with a new efficient device, and that's going to be a challenge going forward as we're all dealing with building electrification, right? We're trying to get people to change out a furnace. Well, it depends how old that furnace is as to how willing they are to change that out. And those have to be taken into consideration on the policy side. So again, it's not just the technology performance, it's going to be the policy, and it's going to be the financial incentives, how they're designed.
Yeah, there's a financial cost to change out a power supply, like a converter. Converter lifespan 7 to 10 years. Brought modems and stuff, and when they come back in after 5 years, you should dump them and upgrade the efficiency of the thing. Light bulbs, same problem. You got to replace all these light bulbs. You're going to pull out. I just did 60 light bulbs in my house, halogens to LEDs, and there's something that's just that you don't want to throw away the halogen just because it's less energy efficient, even though you do the math and you're going to save money doing it. So there are last mile replacement costs to move stuff. And sometimes the consumer is the best person to do that because they're going to the stores, they're going to do that implementation for you.
Igor, if I may, this is Mark, I wanted to throw out sort of another standards kind of question that relates to Sila's talk, which is about data and being able to have data and sensing, guiding all kinds of different decisions and things. And so like in the computer industry, Google's data is Google's and they use it, and Facebook's is theirs and they use it, and they have proprietary advantage because they have a lot of data to work from. And I was wondering, maybe to Sila, asking you the question, David, how do we either are there enough incentives for folks to share their data and their sensing so that we can, so that all of you smart algorithm folks can go, do a better job and does that make sense? Is it a sensible question? And then, Sila, could you maybe address it, or David?
So I just want to do a little bit of a correction. Google's data is not Google's data. My data is Google's data. Or my data is Facebook's data, and I don't like it. And people are just becoming aware of the privacy issues and all of the issues that are related to their data and how others are making money off of their data, right? I think utilities have been really protective of people's smart meter data, not because they're altruistic, I think. I think because what's that?
Marijuana growers.
I think it's a lot of data, and it's very difficult, especially for some of the utilities, very difficult to take a look at this data and extract information. And it's very difficult to share it with others because there's a lot of personally identifiable information that could be captured from that. So the reason data is not being used is partially because this data has a lot of information that comes with it. I wish that there was an opportunity where we have one area or neighborhood or something, right? A city with open data where we can actually get, and people are aware of this, and people can agree to live there, maybe through a set of incentives or something like that, where we can actually capture data from a multitude of different systems, and then think about how we can use this data to create value for the society, create value for the integration companies that want to integrate the system and look at things holistically. We're not there yet. I understand why we're not there yet. Again, we can't do these based on physics-based models. We just need data. And I'm looking for the day that we're going to have one city with all of this data available to all of us.
Can I real quickly address from the utility point? Celia is completely correct. Those under state law now, your smart meter data can be considered personally identifiable data. There are reasons why people don't want their energy consumption patterns made public, right? And you can probably think of most of those. The other aspect about, could you get to it? The short answer is yeah. We do have mechanisms where researchers and partners can get to them. There are mechanisms that allow customers to voluntarily share data, and that can go up to a community level. I've never heard of it at a city level. That's an interesting thought, but there are demonstration projects, and part of the planning for these demonstration projects generally is up front as a part of the criteria to participate to get the benefits, which usually include free, incentives or equipment. Then the participants agree to share the data too. So an example could be, we did a kind of a mini smart grid project down in Irvine a few years ago with UC Irvine, and entire neighborhood there, we had access to that data. There's the state of California, and the PUC is working with the IOU, or the utilities here, Edison and PG&E and the gas company, on a large scale program coming up over the next couple of years in the San Joaquin Valley. And this can be at scale, hundreds of homes, where we're going to look at electrifying them, trying to find, prove out technologies that could make them more affordable. These are low income communities. And part of the standards for participating in that, there will be data sharing on a lot of the information from that for this particular purpose.
I'll just add, from the research perspective, we struggle with this as well. as the Energy Commission, all of our research is publicly available. And so it becomes challenging having these kinds of projects, although what recipients will often do is work with the utilities. They sign an NDA between the two of them about sharing of data. We, the CEC, don't see anything. We don't get that data. We don't have access to it. And of course, we would love to. We'd love to analyze that data too, but there are challenges with the personal information that we don't want to get in the process of sharing. So it is a problem for research overall. I think there are some, a little bit of workarounds on that. I think there's some effort to try to look at challenges on the grid. So, the PUC in their recent, their first decision on the microgrid proceeding actually has the utilities able to work with and set up a portal with communities to share specific information about sensitive areas, or I should say, areas that affect critical facilities in their community, so they can start planning and having conversations about planning that makes sense for the community, particularly for resilience. And I think that's a good next step. It's a little bit more open, but still controlled, still allows that planning, but not widespread distribution of that information to a large community. So we've actually touched quite a bit on second set of my questions, which are related to public-private interaction and incentives and those kinds of contexts. It seems to me that there are some unexplored opportunities here. Let me go back to that number of $15 per hour, right? $15 per month savings. But if we collectively pool those savings and treat it as an investment, almost like a pension fund, then the return in principle could be possibly much bigger for the whole community. Some of these can flow back to individual homeowners, which is an incentive. It's probably what the private companies that are using our data should be doing as well, in the sense that they should ask whether they should use our data and then pay us for it if we agree to it. Are there any thoughts that are going in that direction, which is kind of market or incentive, financial incentive based? Anyone?
Well, real quick, Igor, there are models, again, I'll go back to the solar industry because I spent many years there and that was very successful in California. Some of the big intervention or the big advances there were not on the technology side. I mean, of course there were those, but they were on the financial models. And one of those models, as you know, was sort of pay for performance. And another model is aggregation, right? And so today you have you for example, have a community solar model where you're sharing. You of course can see or could apply that same logic to energy storage. You could have community energy storage, as one of our speakers mentioned. It's a little harder sell. You can also do aggregation models for energy efficiency, and the utilities have done that now with the private sector for the last few years. So we're bidding out opportunities where private sector firms come to us and they say, Gary, I'm going to aggregate 600 customers in North Orange County, and I'm going to give you collectively this kind of savings. And they're working their own financial deal with each individual customer. And yeah, that individual deal for the customer is quite small, but the hassle factor for the individual customer is quite small also, right? And so for the utility, it's actually beneficial for us to deal with one larger aggregated or scaled up bucket of savings, and we're dealing with a professional company that does this for a living, so they know the terms and conditions, they know what the state of California rules are, etc. And so I think aggregation of that kind of thing is always a model. It's not a cure-all, it's not going to solve all the problems, but that's already been done successfully. I'm sorry, I'm going to jump over to Mahnoosh real quick here because I saw the chat screen. Some of the caller asked about the Diablo Canyon shutdown in 2 years and how that'll impact the grid and all that. I don't want to speak for PG&E, but I can tell you in Southern Cal Edison, we had similar scenario a couple of years ago when we shut down our San Onofre nuclear plant. That was over 2 gigawatts, 2,100 megawatts. And part of the way we dealt with that was, not one silver bullet, but a whole portfolio of solutions, including different new generating assets and storage assets, but also aggregated customer assets. So we designed and tested tested some new solicitation approaches. We called it a kind of a local capacity resource type bid area, and we bid in. We asked people, you tell us, you the market, you're closer to the ground on this than we are. Tell us what you can bring to the table, and customers, third party aggregators in effect would bring 50 megawatts of savings from energy efficiency here, or 100 megawatts of solar from something over here. And it's a way that, again, you're tapping, it's done through public policy, it's done through a utility, there's a financing mechanism in place through, we're all ratepayers, but it was also using private interests and private innovation, I guess, that was fairly new. So I think you'll see more of that. There are more, traditional plant generating facility retirements coming up in California, like Diablo and like others, and we don't know what all the answers are, but I think this model is one way to help get there. Igor, to your question, these are small savings, individual cases, but in aggregate, scaled up, they can be quite large. Same thing with EV charging. You heard, I think it was Sila talking about it earlier. EV charging can use some of those models. You can use managed collective or group charging, where you can minimize the impacts on any given person, but you can achieve something significant for that building or that circuit.
Well, I think you're getting at, I think what you're driving the economic model, Gary, and I think you're dead on what you're doing there. I think your cost of acquisitions of the savings is what you're driving down to. And you're picking up the low hanging fruit in the big concentrated areas of usage, but there's a ton of savings to be acquired in replacing refrigerators, LED light bulbs, power supplies all over the place, that it's just too expensive to go down at the moment to go collect up that savings. I think that is the real key to that economic model you're driving. You guys are making good progress in those areas. It's cool.
On that note, let me ask, so we're coming kind of close to our allocated discussion time. So let me ask Mark if we have a brief, time for one more question, or should we slide into the last talk?
I think we're getting pretty close to the edge. I want to make sure Sang-Wan has sufficient time. If there's any closing comment you'd like to make, maybe, or the the panelists would like to. But I think another question might take us too long.
Instead of posing a question, I'm going to ask for advice for us that are still sitting in academic chairs. There are obviously issues, as Gary just pointed out, that have to do with advancement of this area of energy efficiency by providing the right incentives and financial instruments. If the panelists would like to send us emails for, i.e. selfish purposes, to orient us a little bit as to where would be the biggest impact that our algorithms or our methodologies or our hardware can provide, so that coupled with whatever incentives are there out there can actually push this envelope forward. Because we can develop great algorithms and great hardware, and if there is a blockage on the market side, that's not going to be executed very, very, very quickly. So I'll close with asking for a little bit of advice. If anybody from the rest of the audience wants to pitch in and either send us emails or contact us.
Look, we have a few minutes, actually. I would love to hear just now people's impression. I mean, David or Gary, Sila, others, what should we be working on? What's the biggest new opportunity, particularly with how COVID's changed energy consumption? What should we be working on for energy efficiency? What's your number one thing you'd recommend?
I have one bias, and I'll real quickly respond and let David get to it. And that is because it's underappreciated to date, I think, in the state, but a biggest target, and some of you know this, is we have refrigerants and everything, refrigeration, cooling, and HVAC. And, as a society, we're using more of it. We're using more HVAC. It's a tremendous target for carbon reduction, so-called low global warming, or GWP, low global warming potential refrigerants, are coming. There's a lot of research being done on it. The CEC is familiar with this. The utilities are working on it with the private sector. It's a challenge. The big customers are people like the supermarket industries and the food processing and the convenience stores and restaurants, and all of those are kind of low margin businesses, so they don't have a lot of free cash, especially in the time of COVID. Restaurants and stores don't, but you have this vast infrastructure in California of refrigerants that are need to be replaced, and that probably is the single biggest target. It's not as easy to get to as the residential. It's not glamorous. It's not exciting like EVs. Most people never think twice about it, but in my opinion, and our organizations are looking at that pretty heavily, that's a huge target coming down the road.
So, Igor, I just have one comment on this that has been the guiding principle as I do applied research for myself. ARPA-E had this quote, and I sort of think about it all the time, was thinking about it all the time as a researcher, is if it works, so what, right? That's great that these algorithms or systems are working, but who are they creating the value for? How are they going to get the impact that they're going to get to? What are the barriers in terms of markets, policies, and not the technology, obviously? And how are we going to overcome those so that we can actually make a difference? So that has been sort of my guiding principle as a researcher, as an applied researcher. And as a CEO, my guiding principles are completely different from that.
Actually, that's a great point, and I'll just say ARPA-E kind of stole that from DARPA, right? Right, John? The Hail Mary criteria, actually, for everyone in this call, the Hail Mary criteria actually a wonderful set of questions on any research project or any implementation to go by. I'll actually put it in the chat so that everybody can see them. I kind of it's a catechism for me.
Good.
Thanks for the comment.
David? I can't hear you.
Just reiterate the comments previously made. I think we've seen some projects in the commercial industrial space that have been very successful in reducing costs for those low margin arenas. They are more challenging, particularly industrial, where you have a lot of different types of processes, but there are some common pieces of equipment that are used across those technologies where you can get some scale by focusing on those. And I think that is an area that is going to be an ongoing challenge for the state to get to our low carbon is going to be the commercial industrial, particularly the industrial sector side. And so solutions for those, but you obviously have to work with those industries to understand what their critical pain points are to try to find the pieces of equipment that are the most common and the most easily to create efficient algorithms for.
Wow. Igor, on behalf of all of us and all the panelists, David, Sila, Gary, Mahnoosh, Igor, that was great. Thank you. Wow. So with that, thank you, Mahnoosh. I was going to introduce our closing keynote speaker, but Igor, nice job. I mean, wow, that was great. Wow.
Thank you all. It was wonderful. The talks were fantastic. Thanks for being willing to participate. Thanks to the audience as well.
Yeah.
Oh, I put the Hail Mary catechism in the chat if anybody's interested.